I don't know what this agreement is. It doesn't mean that it's terrible. It doesn't mean that it's terrific. It means that it is just a black box. Nobody seems to know precisely what's going on here.
Today is Monday, June 15th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. Over the weekend, President Trump announced that the United States and Iran had reached an agreement that would formally end the war, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and begin a new round of negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Iranian officials confirmed that an MOU had been finalized and is expected to be signed in Geneva later this week. But beyond those headlines, the picture becomes much less clear. Washington and Tehran are already offering different accounts of what the agreement contains. Reports suggest Iran could receive billions of dollars in frozen assets and relief from sanctions on its oil and energy sector. In return, Iran reportedly pledges not to develop a nuclear weapon and enter a 60-day negotiation process over the future of its nuclear program. There are also reports that the agreement could include a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, though Israeli officials dismissed any such arrangement. To offer an analysis of rapidly unfolding events, I'm joined by Jonathan Schanzer, Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a leading Iran analyst. Let's get into it. Jonathan Schanzer, welcome back to Boundless Insights.
Thank you. Great to be back.
It was an eventful weekend, but before we talk about the immediacy, I want to remind people that it was 1 year ago this week, June 13th, 2025, that Israel launched its attack on Iran, taking out senior Iranian leaders and key military targets. And after a few days, America sent B-2 bombers with its bunker-busting munitions to hit Iranian nuclear sites. Netanyahu called it a historic victory. It looked like Iran was pummeled. It looked like the regime may topple. And now here we are a year later with an agreement on the table. What do you say?
I say I don't know what this agreement is. It doesn't mean that it's terrible. It doesn't mean that it's terrific. It means that it is just a black box. Nobody seems to know precisely what's going on here. I mean, the best thing that we have is a 14-point memo that has been released by Mehr News in Iran, which is closely tied to the regime, closely tied to the IRGC, considered to be a propaganda outlet of sorts. And that's the best source we have for information about this deal. There have been little scraps that have come out from U.S. officials, from Israeli officials, from Pakistani officials, from the Iranians themselves. But it's really hard to know what's going on here without a document. Now, even I would say clouding that even further is the apparent existence of side deals, possibly with the United States, certainly with a bunch of Arab countries that appear to have given the Iranian regime or have pledged to give the Iranian regime billions of dollars in exchange for an end to the bombardment of their countries. And, you know, when you start to add all this up, it looks like a lot of money is going to go to the regime, which makes me very nervous. But I think more importantly, I don't know if their ability to hold the world hostage, either by bombarding these oil-producing countries or by keeping a stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz, I don't know whether that's ended or not. I mean, actually, just right before we started recording here, Aviva, I saw something about how the Iranian regime slipped in a clause at the very end of the negotiations.
The tolls,
right?
Even though President Trump announced free passage for everybody, start your ships.
Right. Well, and again, so this is a narrative battle now, but without knowing what's in the deal, I don't know how to piece together the narrative.
Well, when do you expect that we will see the details of the deal?
So Friday is the day that they're saying that this may be signed in person.
Though I did just see a report from Switzerland saying no official request was made for us to host a signing ceremony.
Right. So this thing is all as clear as Turkish coffee right now. I have a really hard time understanding how I'm supposed to analyze this and how we're to make sense of all this. I mean, look, I think it's great that oil prices have tumbled. I think it's great that people are breathing a little bit easier as it relates to, you know, the flow of maritime traffic in this critical, geostrategically vital waterway. But I don't understand how this thing ends in a way that is beneficial for the United States, that is beneficial for the free markets around the world. These things, I think, are still kind of hanging out there in ways that make me uncomfortable. And the discomfort, honestly, is just about being in the dark more than, being worried about one particular clause or another.
We had Andrew Fox on the show last week, and his analysis was essentially that there was an impasse because Iran is willing to endure far more pain than the United States. And the United States is having a big summer. We got the World Cup. We got a big birthday, turns 250 on July 4th. And of course, there's the midterms around the corner. And from President Trump's perspective, he wanted an end to the war to see us through these 3 milestones. And the only way to bring that about was to capitulate and to pay Iran billions of dollars in order to stop the war. And it seems from initial reporting that that is where we have landed.
It does seem that way. It looks like, at least at minimum, there is a $12 billion release of frozen funds. And this is according to Mer News, again, propaganda outlet, so take it all with a grain of salt. But then there'll be another $12 billion during the 60-day final negotiation window. And then there's also this notion that we're going to be presenting, and this is, I'm actually reading directly from what was in that memo, the U.S. and allies must also present reconstruction plans worth $300 billion. And that's on top of the side deals that may also have been locked in. But let me just say, there's one thing that I just want to correct. To say that we didn't have a choice here because the regime was willing to endure more pain means that there was some sort of begin date and an end date in this standoff. I hold the opinion that had we put more economic pressure on the regime for a longer period of time, I think it's quite possible that the regime could have collapsed economically. In other words, I believe that economic fury, as we have started to call it here, I think that there was something to this strategy that would have required a little bit more patience on the part of the U.S. president, which is, of course, his greatest attribute. But, this was the moment, I think, where we could have found out whether this theory of economic collapse could bear out. It looks like we opted out of that.
I don't want to speak for Andrew, but he was saying that there were downstream repercussions on the global south, that the stopping of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was essentially going to collapse the economies of developing countries.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that is an argument, but then the argument would be, okay, how about the United States up its oil production? How about we divert, oil from everywhere else? Because if you have 80% of the world's oil flowing, I mean, I understand that there are choke points and I understand that there are pain points, but that doesn't mean that you can't divert oil to make sure that there's enough for everybody, more or less.
Right. This brings me to my question, which is I think people in this moment are having trouble separating between what's in the best interest of Israel and what's in the best interest of the United States. And to be fair to the American president, I do want to ask you, perhaps ending the war, even at costs that we might not yet fully appreciate, is that in the immediate best interest of the United States?
That is the brilliant question to ask, because we've got to look at the different timeframes. Short term, okay, you could make the argument that because of the spike in oil prices and because of the pressure on the global south, the political pressure here in the United States, that the president was feeling that maybe this was the right thing to do, and that this was the time.
Knowing that after the midterms, when he is essentially in his last 2 years lame duck, that he can do things that perhaps he doesn't feel like he can do right now.
Yes, but I think the odds of him going back and doing this again, there's costs in just ramping up operations like this. There's costs of maintaining our force posture in the region. If we're done, we're likely done. We're moving on. We got to change the channel. We're going to Cuba, or I don't know what else we're going to do. But
Greenland, Canada, there's a long list to get through this year.
I mean, the number of countries that America should apparently conquer is vast. I think there's a question of whether there's a stomach for getting back to this. I think medium term, we have to think about what are the lessons for the region. And here, I've got to say, I think we're about to watch an arms race unlike anything that we've ever seen. I think you're going to start to see missile production at rates that are going to be mind-blowing. The one thing that I think every country just realized in the region is that the asymmetric threat of cheap drones and missiles is something that can hold the entire region hostage. And the regime certainly learned that. The regime is going to start, a mad dash for more because this worked for the Islamic Republic. They need more of these, even though they've got plenty, a bunch were destroyed. I would imagine that they start ramping up in a serious way. And then there are those in the region that are thinking, okay, well, we're going to have to fight fire with fire. You're going to start to see the proliferation of missile programs and drone programs from all over the region with countries that have incredibly deep pockets, endless funds to be able to do this. And, what happens in the Persian Gulf doesn't stay in the Persian Gulf.
It started last night. Russia launched massive waves of attacks against Ukraine, presumably saying, look, there's no policemen in the world anymore.
Right. Let me get to the great power thing in a minute, but I think regionally, I think we're likely to see an uptick. Now, I also think that we're probably going to see a serious spike in missile defense. I think there's going to be a scramble for that because one of the things that I believe led the president to want to get out of this is dwindling stockpiles of THAAD and Patriot and the Israeli Arrow 3. There just simply wasn't enough to go around when you had these massive swarms of drones and missiles. And I think that was a lesson learned here. But bottom line is, when you look around the region, like take the technical stuff out of this, take the military hardware out of this, the United States could not defeat a middling power. And that is the lesson that is going to be taken away here. It's going to have, I think, real ramifications for, the possibility of normalization with a bunch of Arab. Why would they want to join the U.S.-led alliance? If the U.S.-led alliance, the two most powerful air forces in the world, theoretically, could not defeat this junk power in the Middle East, right? That a bunch of cheap drones and missiles and shoulder-fired munitions in the Strait of Hormuz was enough to force the United States to capitulate. I fear that there will be a new order that begins to take shape in the region as a result of this. I don't know what it looks like yet, but I just don't think that it necessarily portends well for the United States or for Israel, or for whatever is left of the U.S.-led alliance there. I think there's probably, let's just say, deep disappointment with how this thing played out. Now, the last part of this is the great power competition component of this, which is to say, exactly as you framed it, there's no sheriff. There is no, great power that is going to keep a lid on chaos. And so, you can imagine the Chinese saying, okay, well, U.S. couldn't stop the Islamic Republic. All right, looks like maybe it's game on in Taiwan. Russia maybe tries to advance further on the edges of Europe. I don't know what that looks like, but, I do get a sense that folks are wondering whether Trump has the stomach to follow through, but it's beyond Trump. And I think there is just a question of America's stomach for continued conflict, whether we make the right decisions on the battlefield. I think all of this is being analyzed in real time. And I don't know if I love the takeaways, at least so far.
Let's talk about what you call Iran as a junk power and their ability to turn things around. Because if we look at where they were a year ago and what they have managed, presumably, to take from this deal, it's quite astounding. The United States and Israel started the war saying they wanted Iran to have no nuclear program, destroy its ballistic missile program, stop its support for terror groups across the region. And I think the unspoken one was that the regime would collapse. Well, that regime did not collapse, firmly in place. Iran hasn't given up an ounce of highly enriched uranium, and we're not even dealing with the program now. It's being negotiated at a later stage. Nobody's talking about its ballistic missile program. And not only are we not really talking about its support for terror groups, they successfully managed to tie Hezbollah to their own front, to the point where any Israeli attack on Beirut is now seen as an attack on Iran.
Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with the way that you've just framed that. I think that the Israelis have to be very unhappy with that last part in particular. The idea that Lebanon is now a sphere of influence of the Islamic Republic that is recognized by the United States is highly problematic, and it does raise significant questions about the way that Israel can and would fight back against continued Hezbollah aggression. We got to wait and see how this one plays out. But if you looked at, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, said, we're not leaving Lebanon. We're there possibly in perpetuity. So you have a defiant Israel right now, but apparently some pretty tough words exchanged between Bibi Netanyahu and Trump over the Israeli decision to strike back. I mean, a little bit ridiculous when you put it in the starkest terms. Israel got hit with Hezbollah drones. Israel responded as any normal country would. And then the U.S. president unleashed on the Israelis for jeopardizing, what is now being described as a peace deal. It's more of like a MOU. We're engaged to be engaged.
You know how it is when you wake up and you expect your birthday to go a certain way. It was Donald Trump was turning 80. It's a milestone birthday. He's going to have a nice UFC fight on the lawn of the White House. Peace in the Middle East, and then nobody's cooperating.
The Israelis gave a great present. They whacked a guy that killed like 5 Americans. It was actually it was a good present, I thought.
It's no Qatari jet, I'll tell you that.
It is not, but I would take it over a Qatari jet 10 times out of 10. I know that at least so far, this conversation's been a lot of doom and gloom. But I do want to just make mention of one other thing.
Great, turn it around for me.
Yeah, I'm going to try. The idea that Iran is getting out of this unscathed is what I question right now. Yes, it looks like they just blackmailed the world and they're getting paid.
It does look like that, yes.
Yes, it does look like they've just extended their sphere of influence, at least for a time, into Lebanon. And it looks like the regime is going to live to fight another day. In other words, it was not brought down. There are, I guess, some reasons to be optimistic about some sort of fulsome nuclear arrangement, which would not be the worst thing in the world for the world. There's this whole idea that during the 60-day negotiation that there is going to be, a commitment not to produce nuclear weapons and a final deal covering nuclear issues.
But all the leverage is gone to force the Iranians to negotiate because their ports are now open. They've gotten a huge infusion of cash. Sorry, this was supposed to be optimistic.
I know, you're killing me here. Theoretically, right? But here's the part where I'm actually more optimistic. I don't think that this is over for the regime. In other words, it got shellacked militarily in June of last year and in March of this year. So it's weaker, demonstrably weaker. The leadership is deeply fractured. We know this because of the negotiations and the different players that have emerged and the sort of power struggles that we can see above board and below board. It does look like that there's a leadership crisis of sorts. There is an economic crisis that, $12 billion is not going to help. $12 billion, I mean, they're running on fumes. I think they're in bad shape. But then there's the other part of it too, which is politically, the regime is isolated. Nobody actually likes this regime. None of the countries regionally, the Europeans, the Gulf Arabs, everybody sees this regime now for what it is. You're not going to see partnerships here with this regime. But then I think there's the last part of it, which is the people of the Islamic Republic are still seething after the murder of 40,000 people back in January. The economy is cratered, which means that, the Toman is worth nothing. Purchasing power is at zero. The availability of goods just not there. There's a huge crisis that is brewing inside the Islamic Republic. In other words, they may have gotten out of this in one piece with the United States, but I don't think their crisis is over. I mean, I would put it this way. After an earthquake, wait for the aftershocks. And there could be aftershocks for the Israelis. There could be aftershocks for other regional players. I suspect there are going to be aftershocks for the Islamic Republic. I don't want to start predicting things here, but I would just say this, like after something this momentous, I would say that the story's not yet fully written.
Good note to end on. Jonathan, thank you very much.
Anytime.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.